Welcome, everybody, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I am pleased to welcome you to our discussion with Jerry Weiser, a Holocaust survivor from Slovakia. Before we begin, I would like to share a few words about the museum. Holocaust Museum LA is the first Holocaust survivor-founded Holocaust museum in the United States. In the 1960s, a group of survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust, and this memorial eventually became Holocaust Museum LA. These survivors who established our museum did so with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Furthermore, they mandated that our museum should always be free to the public, making Holocaust education accessible to everyone. Even though we are not able to be in our museum's physical space for the time being, we are still able to carry forward their mission. This afternoon, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Jerry Weiser, who will share his story with you. After Jerry shares his story, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. Those watching on Zoom can use the Q&A box, and those watching on Facebook can use the comments, and Jerry will answer as many questions as possible. I'm honored to welcome Jerry to this talk, as he's been participating in our educational programs for a few years now at the museum, and his wife Rita is also a docent who has been working closely with our students as well, and we're so happy to have both of them as part of our community and doing so much to teach, educate about the Holocaust. Jerry, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Michael. Let me first share my program. Good morning, everyone. Before I start, let me first introduce myself. My name now is Jerry Weiser. As I share my story with you, you'll understand why I said that my name now is Jerry Weiser. But in order for you to understand where I'm coming from, I'm going to start with my late mother's story first. My mother was 19 years old when World War II broke out. The war broke out on September 1st, 1939. The first act of the war was the invasion of Germany to Poland. My mother was born in a very small city, you can see it in the red circle, on the southern part of Poland, in a city by the name of Tarnów. Notice that the city is right on the border with the state of Slovakia. On the west side of Poland is Germany, and on the north side of Poland is Russia. When the Germans invaded Poland, it took them 5 weeks and 1 day to occupy Poland. 3 weeks after they occupied Poland, Russia invaded Poland and occupied the eastern part of Poland. The Germans didn't invade Slovakia, and the reason was because Slovakia had a fascist government at that time, and in a lot of points, they agreed with the Nazi regime in Berlin. So they didn't have to invade, they just marched into the country, and some people even greeted them with flowers when they came in. And here you can see the school children greeting the German troops marching into the country. Notice that they're holding flowers for the troops and they're saluting them with the Nazi salute when they marched into the country. About 3 months after the invasion, my mother came home and she found out that her parents, her younger brother, and her grandmother are missing. She was looking all over for them. She couldn't find them. Finally, one of the neighbors approached my mother and told her, you know, I saw the Nazi troops coming here and rounding up all the Jews in the neighborhood and taking them away. After this day, my mother never saw her family again. And she was 19 years old, all by herself. She was a student at the time, studying languages, and she didn't have any profession whatsoever. So she didn't know what to do with herself, how she's going to survive. So she decided the best thing for her will be if she'll cross the border and stop in the first city on the border. The name of the city was Žilina. You can see it in the red circle on top, right on the border of Poland. When she got there, she was looking for a job so she can survive. But when she got there, the first thing that she noticed is that they already implemented a rule that a Jewish person can only work for a Jewish person. And since this was such a tiny city, she had very hard time finding a Jewish family or Jewish employer. It took her a while, couple of weeks, until she found an elderly lady that was looking for help in her house. So my mother started the job to work for this lady. She was very happy that she found something. First of all, a place to stay and a place to work. But after a few days that she started working, and she was pretty happy at the job, the lady came to her and she said, you know, I'm very worried because some of the neighbors are already asking about you. And since you are not a citizen of Slovakia, it might be dangerous for you to stay here. So I will suggest to you, why don't you move to a larger city and you can blend in and nobody will know where you're from and so forth. So she told her, why don't you go to the city of Bratislava? Now, Bratislava is the capital of Slovakia. It's a large city with thousands and thousands of people. So my mother took her advice and decided to move there. But before she moved, the lady told my mother, you know, when you get there, you look for the Engel family. It's a pretty known family in the city. And you don't have to look for a job because my daughter who lives there, she needs help in the house. She's working with a husband in their business, a very successful business. The husband is an expert in coffee he is importing coffee from all over the world. And he has a huge warehouse with over 100 employees. So his wife works at this place and she needs help at home. So my mother took her advice and she moved to Bratislava. She looked for the Engel family. She didn't have any problem finding them. They were quite known in the city. And she started working for them and she was very happy on the job. She worked and everything was fine. A few weeks later, she met a young gentleman. And a couple of months later, they decided to get married. But it wasn't so simple because both of them were Jewish and he fled Poland too, like my mother did. So there is no way they can go to the city hall and obtain a marriage license. So they decided the best thing for them will be to live as husband and wife. On September 1st, 1941, I was born. And the name that I was given was Henrich Juraj. When I was about 3 months old, my father, who was an electrician, worked in a factory in Bratislava. And that evening, he didn't come home. My mother went to his workplace and she spoke to the other employees there. And she found out that the Nazi troops came in, picked up all the Jewish employees and took them away. After that day, my mother never saw my father again. And here she was left with a 3-month-old baby. The situation was terrible. Meanwhile, they started building a ghetto in the city. Now, what is a ghetto? They took the small Jewish neighborhood, they built a brick wall all around it, with barbed wires on top. Basically, they built a prison. And now they forced all the Jews from the city to move to this tiny place. They evicted them from their apartments. They told them, leave everything in place, just pack up your belongings, only your valuables. That's all what you need. And they took them to the ghetto. Now the ghetto became so crowded that some places they housed them 6 families in one room. This is how bad it was. The food was scarce too. It was very hard to find food. And there was no medical help of any kind. You couldn't get prescription drugs or anything. And people started dying there. And after a while, bodies were lying on the sidewalk of the city. This is how bad the situation was. Here you can see how the Jews are being forced to go to the ghetto. And notice that they're all wearing a Jewish star on their pallet. This was one of the rules, that all the Jews has to wear it, so when they're walking on the street, everybody can recognize them as Jews. I have here a replica of that star, you can see it. The word Jewish in the middle was put in every country in their own language. And here you can see them walking to the ghetto. When I was about 7 months old, my mother was forced to go to the ghetto. The minute my mother stepped into the gate, through the gate, into the ghetto, she saw those conditions. She said to herself, there is no way a 7-month-old baby can survive those conditions. She had a hard time finding food for herself. How she's going to feed a baby? So in her mind, she said to herself, I have to find a way to smuggle this baby out of here. Luckily, she was lucky. There was a nurse, a volunteer, that came to the ghetto twice a month, just for the day, to help the women in the ghetto. I mean, she couldn't help much. There were thousands of women, and she came just for the day. But my mother approached her, and she said to her, you know, I have a 7-month-old baby. I don't think the baby can survive those conditions. Will you be willing to smuggle my baby out through the gate? Luckily, the lady agreed. She said, prepare the baby, and by the end of the day, I'll come to you and I'll smuggle the baby out. One of the things that the Germans were very good at was in deception. And one thing among other things that they did, they printed money to be used only in the ghetto. And here you can see a German note of 1 mark. But notice on the top left corner, there is a Jewish star. And on the other side of the note is a Jewish menorah. And this money was to be used only in the ghetto. They wanted to show the world that everything is normal in the ghetto. Life is normal. People are buying, people are selling, they have money to buy, to sell. Nothing from the further from the truth, because there was nothing to buy and there was nothing to sell. The only thing that really the Germans used this money for, they took the valuables from the people who came to the ghetto and gave them this piece of paper. It was worthless. It was like monopoly money. You couldn't do a thing with it. But this is what the deception and propaganda was all about. Now, the lady took me. She came to my mother in the evening to pick me up. I don't know if I can describe to you the condition. I don't know. My mother gave me to her, and she stuffed me in her medical bag. And she wasn't sure that she ever going to see me again. Especially there were already rumors that they're going to liquidate the ghetto and send them all to the camps. But she said to herself, this is the only chance that this baby has a chance to live outside of those walls of this ghetto. Now the lady took me, and my mother with a heavy heart gave me up. And the lady took me, and what did she do with me? Well, she smuggled me through the gate, and she deposited me in the city church. Now, the church couldn't keep me for long because the authorities used to come and inspect all the public places in the city, including the churches, to see if anybody is hiding a Jewish person or a Jewish child. So they had to distribute those kids outside of the church because they were hiding other children beside me. And they decided to give the children to the church members. Luckily, I was given to a farmer outside of the city. Now, this farmer was a God-fearing gentleman and a very brave one, because he took me and he hid me for 3.5 years till the end of the war. He hid me not only from the Germans who used to come and inspect the private homes to see if anybody is hiding a Jewish person or a Jewish baby, also from his good neighbors, good friends, because if they'll find out that he is hiding a Jewish child, they'll tell the authorities because they had an incentive, because if they tell the Germans, they'll get a reward for it. So you can see how brave he was by hiding me there for 3.5 years. Meanwhile, the German closed the ghetto and took all the Jews, they loaded them on train, on a cattle wagons. They put them in, they squeezed them in like sardines. There was hardly space to sit down. There was no restroom. There was a bucket in the corner. There was no privacy. There was no food or water. The only air that came in to the wagon was through the cracks of the wooden walls of the wagon. So you can see how bad it was on the wagon. Some people, especially the elderly, died on the train before they arrived to the camp. Usually it took between from the ghetto to the camp about 2 to 3 hours with the train. It took my mother 10 days because the German had a priority on the tracks to take their ammunition and take their supply to their troops. So they really didn't care that the Jews are sitting on the train with no food and no water in those conditions. But first the train, when they left the ghetto, went to the same city that my mother crossed the border, to Žilina. And the reason was because this city had a train depot. And when I visited this place in 2009, I found this memorial there. It stands there today, and it says on the track on the memorial, Road of No Return. None of the Jews who ever left on the train from this point never came back alive. They were all murdered in the camps. After the 10 days, my mother finally arrived at Auschwitz. And here is the entrance to the camp. And you can see here on top of the gate, it says, Arbeit macht frei. And the translation is, work will set you free. That's another deception, another propaganda act to show the world that this is a working camp, people are coming, going, everything is normal. But this was a big lie. Thousands of people were dying there every day. Of course, they had hard labor there, and this is what this camp was about. And my mother arrived in this camp. After a while, since the train were coming from all over Europe, the camp became overcrowded. So what did the Germans do? They built another camp about a mile away. And here it is. And it was called Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. And here you can see this camp was the size of a city. This is how big this place was. But notice in the front, you see some buildings are missing. And the reason was, towards the end of the war, when the Russian troops were marching towards the camps, the Germans wanted to eliminate the camps like it never happened. They didn't want to leave any evidence that was ever a camp there. So they started demolishing the camp. So the first thing they did, they burned those buildings in front that you can see that are missing. Those are all wooden buildings, so they burned them down. They didn't have enough time to burn the buildings behind it, the brick buildings. This is why they're standing there today. By the way, if you visit Poland, you can visit the camps. They're all museums today, open to the public. Notice another thing here in front, you can see a fence around the camp. Now this fence was an electric fence. If you touch it, you're a dead person on the spot. You're being electrocuted on the spot. When I took this photo, when I visited the camp, it was summertime. You can see it's nice and green. It looks like maybe a country club or a golf course. But during the war, it was all gray and black. Even the snow that was falling down was black. And the reason was because after they marched the Jews who came to the camp through the gas chamber, they burned them in the ovens, day and night. And the ashes were covering this whole camp, the whole city. And the smell was horrible. I want to bring to your attention the condition of the Jews who arrived at the camp. First of all, those who survived the trip, they unloaded them off the train. And the first thing they did to them, they separated the families. Women and children went one way, men went to the other way. They never saw their family again. So you can imagine their mental condition. Then they shaved their head, and then they tattooed a number on the arm. From this moment, nobody called you by your name, only by your number on your arm. They treated you like cattle. This is the condition. And I don't have to mention that they were all starving to death. They were so hungry. They didn't have food for days. And this is when they got there. The meal of the day in the camp was a piece of bread, a tiny piece of bread, and a dirty water that they called soup. So those are the condition of the Jews who arrived in the camp. After a while, I wanted to show you this photo. This photo is a very famous photo, the entrance to the camp. Notice that there are tracks here, and through the gate, they unloaded the Jews inside the camp. What's special about this particular photo is when it was taken. This was taken on the 50th anniversary of liberation of the camp. And there was a ceremony there with thousands of people on the ground. By the way, last January this year, on January 27th, we celebrated the 76th year of liberation of the camp. But notice in this photo what is special about it. You can see a flyover on top of the gate of 3 F-15 jets from the Israeli Air Force. They were asked to fly over the camp because there was the motto of the Israeli army is never again. This will never happen to the Jewish people again. So they flew over 3 F-15 jets. The commander of this flight, his mother is a survivor of this Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. There was a small detail I want to tell you about the flyover. How it happened was the Polish government had an exhibition of aircrafts in Poland, and they asked Israel to send their aircrafts to the exhibition too. And the Israeli commander of the Air Force said, I'll send the aircrafts only in one condition, that they will be allowed to fly over the camp. After a lot of negotiations, the Polish government agreed, and this is how the flight came about. Now, Israel is a tiny, tiny country. If you look on the map of Israel, you'll see the eastern border is the Jordan River. That's the border with the state of Jordan. On the west side is the Mediterranean Sea. That's the other border. If you take those jets, it takes them exactly 3 minutes to cross the country. This is why they had to have such a strong army in Israel. This is the same flyover over the camp. But in this slide, I wanted to show you the size of the camp. You can see those are jets flying over. This is the size of a city. This is how big this camp was. While my mother was in the camp, there were a few professions that the Nazis needed. They needed builders, plumbers, and electricians because the camp was so huge. They needed a crew to maintain the camp. So they chose between the prisoners, the people who can do this job. Another thing that they needed was an orchestra, a band, because as cruel as the Germans were, they loved classical music. So why to do a deception? While they were marching the Jews to the gas chamber, they played them classical music from the band that they put together among the prisoners. Another very important professions that they need, since the Jews came from all over Europe, the German needed to communicate with them. So they needed translators, somebody who speaks languages. And since my mother was studying languages, she spoke 5 languages. She spoke German, Polish, Czech, Slovak, and Yiddish. So they used her as a translator. By being a translator, I mean her physical condition was bad as everybody else, but at least it saved her from the gas chamber because she was needed for them. By being a translator, one of the privileges that she had was to write a postcard from the camp outside. And here you can see a copy, that postcard that my mother wrote. And who did she write it to? She wrote it to the Engel family, because before the nurse left the ghetto with me, she asked her for one favor. Please let the Engel family know where you're taking the baby. So at least somebody outside of those walls will know where the baby is. So here she is writing to the Engel family and basically asking them, how is my Henrich Juraj doing? She wanted to know whatever happened to me. But because this was also a deception and a propaganda act, my mother never got an answer, because the mail only went one way. It went from the camp outside. The mail never came back to the camp. One of the conditions that the Nazis gave to my mother writing this postcard, she had to write her return address. And here you can see Pomeranz Gisela was her name. 7747 was the number that was tattooed on her arm. And she resided in block 11, Camp Birkenau. So they showed the world, mail is flowing between the camp and outside world and coming back, but this was a lie. The mail never came back to the camp. While my mother was in the camp, every morning, you can see on the left in this illustration, they did a roll call, just to stand up and being counted by the number, not by your name. And sometimes the roll call took hours in freezing cold weather, icy ground. They were standing there. They were so weak. Some of them just fainted from hunger. Some of them just died of hunger. But nobody picked them up. They stood there for hours. And my mother was among them. As I told you, my mother's physical condition was bad as everybody else. But she said to herself, I have to stay sane because those conditions can drive me to be crazy. So what did she do? She decided to compose poems. Every night when she was lying in her bunk, she started to compose poems. She had nothing to write it on, so she just recited them to herself all night long. Here you can see the first poem that she composed. All the poems together, she composed 11 of them. All of them were in German and they rhymed. But here what you're looking at is a translation to English, so It doesn't rhyme anymore, but it's an accurate translation. And on the last line of the poem, you can see it says, "We will build a better world." This was in the beginning when my mother just came to Auschwitz. And she thought that soon she's going to be released and resume her normal life. She didn't know that she's going to be in the camps for over 3 years. This is the booth that the officer who was conducting the roll call was sitting in. So you can see he didn't really care how long it takes because his condition was nice, warm, protected in this booth. Towards the end of the war, my mother ended up in this camp. It was called the Ravensbruck Camp, one of the worst camp of all. It was a women's camp, and the guards in this camp were women too. And they were more cruel and bad than the men guards in Auschwitz. But now a small detail. This camp, the Ravensbruck camp, is in Germany. Auschwitz-Birkenau is in Poland. How did she get there? Well, towards the end of the war, the Germans started closing all the Polish camps and marched them into this camp, into the camps in Germany. And my mother was among them. One morning, every prisoner got a whole loaf of bread instead of the small piece of bread. And they were wondering what happened to the German? Why are they so generous suddenly? It didn't take them long and they found out why. Because they start marching them from Poland to Germany. It took them 3 weeks in the March of January, freezing cold weather. Only 1/3 of those thousands of people who started this march made it. Luckily, my mother was among them. 2/3 of the people who started this march perished on the way. Some of them from hunger, some of them from freezing cold condition, and some of them were just shot by the German if they sat down for a minute to rest. When my mother got to the camp, she was skin and bones. She could hardly stand on her feet. This is how weak she was. And she wrote her last poem in the camp. And I'm going to read you the last paragraph. It says, "The souls are too weak to believe and doubt the power of God, who witness this and offer no help." In this point, my mother completely lost her faith in God and humanity. Where was God and where was humanity when so many people perished? 6 million Jews, among them 1.5 million children. But luckily, on October 1st, 1945, my mother was liberated by the Russian army. And the Red Cross came into the camp and collected some women, among them my mother, and sent them to Sweden, to the city of Stockholm, to go through rehabilitation. When my mother got there, she was hospitalized for a while, and she was going through the rehab. While she was going to the rehab, on her spare time, she started performing in the Jewish theater. But she wasn't an actress, so what did she do? She recited her poems, and she became very famous. Even the Swedish newspaper wrote about her, an article here, you can see her with a photo, and they gave her a title. They called her the Poetess of Auschwitz. When she got there, the first thing that she did, she wrote a letter to the Engel family to tell them that she was released from the camp. Now, meanwhile, the Engel family came back from the mountains where they were hiding, came back to the city. And she asked them, "Go and pick up my son wherever he is." And the Engel family went to the church and went to the farmer and brought me back to Bratislava. Now, my mother tried to be reunited with me in Sweden, to bring me over to Sweden. But the government of Sweden wouldn't allow it because she was only a temporary resident there. But she couldn't come back to Slovakia or to Poland either, because now it was under the communist regime and the Iron Curtain came down. So nobody can leave this place. It was like a prison. So how can she come back if she cannot leave? So she decided the best thing for her, she was corresponding with her only cousin that survived the war from the whole family, and he lived in Israel. And he wrote to her, "Why don't you come and join me in Israel?" So my mother took his advice, she boarded a ship, and she sailed to Israel. This was in 1947, 2 years after the end of the war. But just before she arrived to the shores of Israel, at that time, Israel was under the British mandate. So they wouldn't allow any Jewish immigrants to come to Israel, even the survivors from the camps. So just before she arrived to the shores of Israel, a British Navy ship turned the ship around and sent all the passengers to the island of Cyprus. Now, Cyprus is a small island just across from Israel. So after being 3 years in the German camps, my mother ended up in a British camp now. And here you can see her behind barbed wires with the guard tower behind her. She stayed there for a whole year till the end of when Israel was declared independence in May of 1948. This is when she was allowed to go to Israel. Meanwhile, I was in the Prisigan family. At the Engel family here, you can see me. This is my first photo that I have of myself. I don't have any baby photos or anything like that. I want to mention one thing that I forgot to tell you about the Engel family that my mother was working for. The Engel family was not forced to go to the ghetto. And the reason was because they had such a successful business, the coffee business. The German confiscated this business and gave it to one of the sympathizers. But this sympathizer didn't have any idea how to run a coffee business. So they forced the Engel family to run the business for him. So this is why they were safe staying in the city. But after a while, when the condition got really bad, they just paid away and they escaped to the mountains. This is how they survived the war. Meanwhile, I was with the Engel family. But after a while, even though 6 million Jews were murdered in the ghettos and in the camps, the anti-Semitism in Bratislava was still very strong, very anti-Jewish atmosphere. So the Engel family was afraid to keep me. So they went to the next door neighbor. It was a Christian family by the name of Prisigan, the Prisigan family. And I asked them, "Are you willing to take this child to your house temporarily?" And they agreed. And my mother knew about them very well because while she was working for the Engel family, she befriended them too, right next door neighbor. So I came to the Prisigan family and I felt at home. They treated me like their own son. They had one daughter by the name of Magda. She was about 10 years older than me. And from the first moment, she liked me like her own brother. And she called me my little brother. So this is how good I felt in this house. The first thing that the Prisigan family did, they changed my name. And they called me Jurek. They gave me a Henrich Juraj name, a Slovak name. Jurek is a Slovak name. And I felt very well with the name. And here I was growing up in their house. Here you can see some of the photos that I have in my album. On the left side, you can see Mr. and Mrs. Prisigan. On the right side, you can see me with their daughter Magda holding me. This was taken in their living room in the house. So you can see it was a nice, solid family. And here I am 6 months later. Summer came and they took some photos in the backyard, me and the whole family. They had 2 dogs. This is one of them. It was called Lord. They had another small dog. And while I lived with that family, you can see that I'm celebrating Christmas with them. It was a joyful time. And notice that I'm wearing a sailor outfit. Now, after the war, in all over Europe, all the children were wearing military outfit. It was very popular, very much in style. And this outfit, my mother sent me from Sweden before she left for Israel. Of course, the Prisigan family never told me that. This I found many years later. And I was wearing it. I was so proud to wear it. And I said to myself as a child, when I grow up, this is what I want to be. I want to be a sailor. And here you can see me. And here you can see on the right, the other dog that they had. Not only I celebrated Christmas with the family, on the left, you can see me with Mrs. Prisigan. Every Sunday, she took me to church, to the same church that I was hidden. The church still stands there today. She took me every Sunday to the church. And not only she took me every Sunday to the church, she even baptized me in the church. And I have a certificate to prove it. And here on the right, you can see me reading outside of the book. I guess after they enrolled me in school, they wanted to show everybody that I know how to read. This is my guess. And this is the city of Bratislava. On the left, you can see the church that I was hidden and went every Sunday with Mrs. Prisigan, and I was baptized in this church. On the right, you can see the house that I was living with Mrs. and Mr. Prisigan and Magda, the daughter. I found this house in 2009 when I visited them. I mean, Mr. and Mrs. Prisigan passed away, but their daughter lived at the time in this house. You can see, I didn't find many changes in the house. The house looked exactly the same. The only changes that I found was in the backyard, I remember there was a cherry tree that I used to climb on the tree and pick up the cherries in spring. Well, the cherry tree is gone. The only thing that they added over the time, they added up a TV dish and a solar panel on the roof. Those things we didn't have in 1945 when I was in the house. We didn't even have TV at that time. When my mother arrived in Israel, the first thing that she did, she contacted the Jewish agency and asked them to find me and bring me together to be with her. Well, the Jewish agency contacted this gentleman that you see here, Rabbi Dr. Solomon Schonfeld, a very famous rabbi in London. During the war, he was a chaplain in the British Army. And his life calling was to save children. He saved over 3,000 children before the war, during the war, and after the war. And he was sent by the Jewish agency to go to Bratislava and find all the orphan and misplaced Jewish children and take them out of the country. Well, when he came, he was wearing this uniform, even though it was 3 years after the war. And the reason was because he knew that the communists have a lot of respect for military outfit. This is why he was wearing this outfit. And one evening, as bad as it was, he came to the Prisigan family to pick me up. I don't know if I can describe you the condition of this evening. I mean, the Prisigan family didn't want to give me up. I didn't want to leave. Why should I leave my parents? I was sure that those are my parents. And this is my system. Well, I didn't have a choice and I had to leave. Everybody was crying. They were crying. I was crying. They packed me a small suitcase with my little belongings that I had and my stuffed animal that I had, that I went to bed every night with. And they told me, don't lose the suitcase. Make sure you don't lose it. So I remember when they took me away and we took a train ride, I didn't sleep all night because I was so afraid that I'm going to lose the suitcase. This is what I remember till today. But after I left, I was united with some other kids that he already collected. Here is the first group that I met, and I'm right in the middle. For some reason, in all the photos, I'm always in the middle. Maybe because I was one of the youngest kids in the group. They took us first to a Jewish orphanage house while he was collecting the kids. And later on, I met some other kids that he collected. Altogether, he collected 148 children. Now, when he collected them, now he needed a collective visa to take us out of the country. So he started preparing the visa, and then he got a few conditions from the Slovak government, the communist government. One of the reasons was children who are Slovak kids cannot leave, because he had kids from Romania, from Hungary, from other European countries that were in Bratislava. And me, with my name of Jurek, I couldn't leave. So the rabbi changed my name. You can see on the visa here in the highlight, he changed my first name to Georgi. So now my name was Georgi Prisegel. This is kind of a Romanian, Armenian name. The second condition that he had was the children over 15 years old can't leave either. And he had some children who are 16 and 17. So he manipulated their birth certificate to show that they're only 15. Well, after he made all those arrangements, we could leave Bratislava. And we went on a very long journey. We left Bratislava and we crossed Europe. We crossed Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium. He was looking for us for a temporary resident until he'll find for us a permanent residence. None of those countries was willing to take us in, even not on a temporary period. So finally, he didn't have a choice, and we ended up in London, in England. When we got there, he contacted a good friend of his who gave a lot of money and a lot of his time for a lot of Jewish causes. And he begged him, please, Mr. Levy, find me a house that I can house 100 kids. He found 48 Jewish homes who were willing to take 48 kids, but he was left with 100 kids, nowhere to house them. This gentleman, with his connections, was looking all over England to buy a building. He couldn't find anything. Not that he couldn't find the building itself, even though it was 3.5 years after the war. There was still shortage of food in Europe. So the government of England gave every family a coupon book with coupons, and you can buy food only with those coupons that you had. The government of England wouldn't issue him 100 booklets for the children. So we couldn't stay because we couldn't buy food. So finally, one morning, Mr. Levy called the rabbi and he told, Rabbi, I have good news and bad news for you. The good news is I just purchased a building for you and the kids and all the volunteers that are with you. Very spacious place, a large space, a great place. The bad news is it's in Ireland and you have to travel to Ireland. So we didn't have a choice. We boarded a ship in London and we sailed to Ireland, to the city of Dublin. We boarded a bus in Dublin and we drove to the house that he bought for us. And this is the house. It was a castle. It was built in 1639, a very old castle. But let me tell you, inside, it was all shiny and marble, such a luxury I cannot even describe to you. I mean, Queen Elizabeth wouldn't be ashamed to live here. This is how fancy this place was. On the ground floor, there were big halls. The rabbi converted them to small rooms as classrooms so we can study while we were there. One of the conditions of the Irish government was that all the kids have to leave the country in 12 months. This put a lot of pressure on the rabbi to find home for all of us in 12 months. But meanwhile, while we were there, we were playing basketball, soccer, hide and seek. The elderly kids had very hard time playing hide and seek because it always reminded them the time that they were hidden during the war. I didn't have this issue because I was a baby. I don't even remember that I was in. This only I know from the stories I was told. Now you have to understand that this rabbi with his organization, it was an Orthodox Jewish organization. So I cannot be there with the name of Georgi Prisigan. They had to give me a Jewish name. So they changed my name and they gave me the name of Avraham Dov. This was my new name while I was in the castle. After 9 months, me and 24 other kids, we boarded a ship and we sailed to Israel. I came to Israel to a transfer camp. The next morning, a tall gentleman came, picked me up, and he said, "Now I'm going to take you to your mother." Well, we drove on a bus and we arrived in the city of Tel Aviv, and I met my mother for the first time. I was skeptical about it because I was sure that the Prisigan family is my family. So it took me a while to realize that this is my mother. When we traveled in Europe, when we crossed Europe, they never told us where our next stop is. They didn't tell us where they're taking us. So when I got to Israel, I wasn't sure that this is my last stop either. So it took me a few weeks to realize that now I'm staying here with my mother, and this is really my mother. But when I got there, my mother said to me, "You know, Avraham Dov is a nice name, a nice Jewish name, but I want to give you a nice Israeli modern name." And she changed my name to Yoram. Yoram was similar to Jurek, so she liked that name. So from now on, I was called Yoram. And then she enrolled me in school. Before I left Ireland, I said goodbye to this lady on the left. Her name was Lily. She was a lady that took care of me while I was in the castle. Later on, many years later, I found out that she was only 16 years old at that time. And she was one of the hidden children too. And they gave him a job to take care of me while I was in the castle. And here, my mother enrolled me in first grade. I had to start all over because I didn't speak any Hebrew. And here you can see me on the left corner at the top. I was the oldest kid in the class. I was 8 years old, and I was the smallest one because all the undernourishment that I took while I was during the war. So it took me a while to gain my weight. And you remember that I showed you when I was wearing the sailor outfit at Christmas in the Bratislava at the Prisigan family, and my dream was to become a sailor. So guess what? When I grew up, I became a sailor. I became an officer in the Israeli Merchant Marine. I don't smoke anymore. This is a bad habit that I had then when I took this photo. And here are some photos of my family that I have in my album. On the left, you can see my mother with her cousin that she married. But because they were blood related, they never had children of their own. And my mother's cousin, who became her husband, adopted me as his son. And he was a wonderful father to me all his life. On the right, you can see me with my mother. You can see a difference of 14 years between those two photos. My mother got a little bit more mature, older, a different hair color, but nothing special about that. Women change their hair color all the time. But this is me. She came to Los Angeles to celebrate with us, with our son, Bar Mitzvah. And here are some other photos that I have. On the left, you can see the daughter of the Prisigan family, Magda, that called me my little brother. She gave me this photo when I arrived in Israel. And she wrote on the back of the photo, "So you'll always remember me." When 65 years later, I met her in Bratislava, and you can see me right in the middle here. and she still called me my little brother. In 1970, when I got married, the Prisigan family wanted to send us a meaningful gift for our wedding. The only thing they could think of was to send us their wedding bands, their original wedding bands. So when we got to Bratislava, my wife decided to give those bands back to Magda, because she didn't even know that we got it as a wedding gift. And this was a souvenir from her parents. Of course, she didn't want to take it. There was a big argument, and we ended up by splitting the bands. She got one, and we have one. Here is another photo of me on the steps of the castle. I'm right in the front. But notice, this photo became very famous because a lady in London by the name of Barbara Barnett, she is 95 years old today, a very sharp and bright lady. She decided to write a book about the castle, the children, and the rabbi. It took her 15 years of research because she wanted to put every detail in the book. She wanted to put all the 148 children's story in the book. Unfortunately, she only found 40 kids to write the story, and my story is among them. And she published the book in Dublin, Ireland, and there was a big ceremony there, and I was invited among the other guests. And you can see me here on the right with Barbara Barnett, the lady who put the book together. And here on the left, you can see the same photo that you saw here. It's right on the front of the book. And look at the title she gave to the book, The Hide and Seek Children, on the game of hide and seek that we played in the castle. It was a beautiful ceremony there. And the Minister of Education of the government of Ireland came to the ceremony. And he apologized for the government of Ireland that put some pressure on the rabbi that all the kids have to live in 12 months. And while we were there, you can see us standing in front of the castle. The people that you see there here, we were all kids at the time, all together in this castle. You can see in this photo that the castle is not in the greatest shape. It belongs to two women now. I don't think they have the funds to keep up the place, so it looks a little bit neglected. While we were there, it was kind of a small reunion. It was wonderful. You know, I want to bring to your attention what was the purpose of Hitler and the Nazi regime in Germany. They wanted to eliminate the Jews from this earth. Well, they killed 6 million Jews, among them 1.5 million children. And my revenge is this, my family today. I have 2 sons and 3 grandkids. I know a lot of people, a lot of times when I speak in the museums, they ask me, the first question is, how come you are Jerry Weiser now? Well, let me tell you, the secret is when I came to the United States in 1975, for some reason, the American had a very hard time pronouncing my name. They called me Yorman, any way you can think of, but not Yoram. So finally, I got so tired of it, and I changed my name to Jerry. Everybody knows how to pronounce it, everybody knows how to spell it, so there was no problem. My last name, Weiser, that I got from my adoptive father, I didn't have to change because everybody in America knows how to spell Budweiser. The thing that I want you to take away from my story is, you saw how many people took part in saving me. The church, the farmer, the Engel family, the Prisigan family. So many people were involved in saving my life. So I want you to take away not to be a bystander. If you see something wrong, speak up, do something like those people did. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Your story is so. I appreciate the way that you end by saying that so many people played a role in saving you. So thank you so much. We do have some questions. Um, First, when you lived with the Prissigan family, did you call them mom and dad, or did you call them Mr. and Mrs. Prissigan?
I'm quite sure I called them mom and dad. I cannot recall, but I'm quite sure.
Thank you very much. And how old were you when you met your mother in Israel?
She left me in the ghetto when I was 7 months old, and I met her in Israel when I was 8 years old.
You mentioned a little bit that you were uncertain or that it felt weird to accept the fact that she was your mother. Um, do you remember at what point you realized that she was actually your mother and that this was in fact your last stop?
Well, basically, the love that she gave me. I mean, she was so loving, and I felt so warm at home. So I felt that really this is my mother. You have to understand what I went through. You know, I went through being a Christian, raised as a Christian. Then I became an Orthodox Jew. Then I came to Israel and my mother was completely a secular Jew. She didn't want to hear about God or anything. She never stepped into a temple. So it took me a while to get my thought together and love my mother as she loved me.
Thank you very much. You and did you let's see. When you were with her and her at what point did she marry her cousin, your stepfather?
I guess she married him in 1949 when she arrived in Israel.
Okay, and so they were already married when you arrived in Israel.
Yes, yes.
And you've talked about not knowing that he wasn't your biological father until later in your life. Can you talk
Yes.
about that?
I didn't know, I was sure that this is my biological father, but I found it out many years later when my mother passed away and we were mourning my mother's passing, and we were sitting in our living room in Israel, and my cousin came to sit with us, and he told her, you know, Yoram is not really my son. This is the first time that I heard it when I was sitting there. It was a shock to me at that moment.
Did you ever learn about your biological father?
No, we were looking for him for a long time. I did my DNA test to find him through other sources, but no, we couldn't find him. No. I know that he was taken to Auschwitz, this I know, but not more than that.
And how did you find that part out?
Through research also, you know, I got a lot of information. It took us 3 years to find the story that I told you today, because, you know, there are two groups of survivors. One group that talks every occasion that they have about the Holocaust. They're reliving it every day. And there's another group like my mother. You know, my mother never spoke about the Holocaust, never. And she only recited the poems to me by heart, but she never spoke about it. She only told me, you know, whenever my wife asked a question about the Holocaust and her part in it, she always said, I'm trying to bury it and you're trying to dig it out. She said, if I pass, just go to the closet and you'll find all kinds of documents and you'll find whatever you're looking for. And when my mother passed away, we went to the closet and we found a lot of documents. Among them, we found those 4 postcards that my mother wrote from Auschwitz that the Engel family gave to my mother after the war. So this is why we found a lot of information. And also we found from the Magda, the daughter of the president, she told us a lot about my mother, and Mrs. and Mrs. Engel told me a lot about it. So this is how we collected all the information.
Thank you very much. Is there a way to get copies of your mother's poems or to read them?
Well, it wasn't published. I have them. During this epidemic now, I put together all my mother's poem together. It's kind of a booklet. I'll show it to you in a second. Here is the booklet. And inside are all the poems, but it wasn't published. You can see they're all printed.
Thank you so much for sharing
Maybe
that.
one day it will be published.
Well, I'm sure.
By the way, my wife translated them from German to English.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for doing that. And I'm sure people would be really moved to read those poems. And I'm glad that you had the opportunity to put them together. When you were living with the Prissigans, were you aware at all of the circumstances of the war?
No, not at all. Not at all. It was after the war, and I was very sheltered there with their family, and I felt like at home. I was very young too, don't forget, I was 6, 7. When I came, I was 4.5 years old.
You mentioned the first hiding place you were with a farmer. Do you know anything about that family, or do you have any knowledge about the first place you were hidden?
Unfortunately, I don't. The only thing that I know that's connected to the farmer, it's not really a connection, but when I visited Bratislava in 2009 and I met Magda, she mentioned one thing. When I came, I never cried. And I guess because I was hidden, probably I was forbidden to cry. So when I came to the Prissigan family after the war, she told me as a young boy, I never cried.
Thank you for sharing that. How many languages do you speak?
I think I speak German, Polish, Hebrew, and some Yiddish. And English, of course. Makes it 5.
Great. And did your parents in Israel speak, do you remember them speaking Yiddish with one another, or did they try to speak Hebrew mostly?
Well, with me, they spoke Hebrew. Between themselves, they spoke Polish for many, many years. Later on in years, they started speaking Hebrew between themselves. And German, I heard a lot of my parents' friends spoke German, so I learned it just from listening to them speaking German.
Thank you for sharing. When and why did you come to the United States?
Well, I participated in the Israeli army in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. I was in the unit that built the bridges over the Suez Canal. And I lost 13 of my friends from my military unit. And after the war, I couldn't find myself. I said, I have to clear my head. So I came to California for a visit, and some opportunities came up, and I stayed. This is in short.
Thank you very much. You mentioned your mother, that she was secular. And this is, sort of a personal question, but did you, how did faith and religion play a role in your life after everything you went through and from the time that you were reunited with your mother until now?
Well, like I said, with my mother, I grew up as a secular Jew. And then when I got married, my wife belonged to a conservative Judaism temple. So I became conservative. And now I want to be with my grandkids together at holidays at the temple, and they are Reformed. So now I'm Reformed. I went all the stages. So, but as a kid, it didn't affect me because, you do what your family does, So I grew up, I felt fine everywhere I was. I mean, my mother celebrated all the holidays so it was okay. She just didn't want to have anything to do with religion.
When did your parents pass away?
Well, my mother passed away about 14 years ago, and my father passed away 7 months later, 9 months later. My mother was 85 when she passed away, and my father was almost 90.
When you talked about visiting Magda after, when was that?
It was in 2009. I decided to
So that
visit.
was after your parents had passed
Yes,
away.
it's after. I was planning one time, I visited Israel, and I was planning to go, I think it was 2 years before that. I was planning to go to visit Bratislava and to visit Magda. But unfortunately, just before we were supposed to leave, my father got sick and he was hospitalized. So we extended our visit in Israel. So the visit to Bratislava never came through. So in 2009, we made it.
So you mentioned that your mother and her second husband were first cousins. Um, what do you know about their family, and did any of their other relatives survive? Whether either, or did they have any other cousins or anyone?
The only one that survived was my father's brother. He was in the underground Polish army, and he came later on to Israel. And this is the only family that we had. My mother had a sister that she moved to Brazil before the war. She was 12 years older than my mother. And that's the only, and I never met her because I never went to Brazil. But I met my father's brother. We were very close in Israel. And of course, his kid, David's kids, his brother's kids. So he had 3 cousins. I had 3 cousins. That's the only family that I had. I didn't have any grandparents or uncles or anything like that.
Since your mother never talked about her experiences during the Holocaust, did she ever talk to you about her life before the Holocaust?
Well, she came from a religious family.
Her childhood,
Yeah.
parents?
Yeah. Her parents, yes. She had a younger brother, like I said. And her mother passed away after the birth, and the father remarried another lady. And I know in one point before the war, the father had two sisters in the United States, and he came to New York, and he wanted to bring the whole family to America, but his mother-in-law didn't want to come to live at the village where they lived. So he came back to Poland, and this is when the war broke out, and they were all killed during the Holocaust.
Thank you for sharing. You mentioned visiting concentration camps later in your life. Did you personally visit concentration camps?
Yes.
And if so, what was that experience like?
Oh, what can I tell you? It was terrible. I visited with my family Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau. We walked from Auschwitz to Auschwitz-Birkenau. I remember my mother visited also the camps after the Iron Curtain was lifted. And I remember she told me that she visited it, and my mother got a heart attack when she visited Poland. And I think the reason was she was very upset when she visited Auschwitz, because she said when we came there, she saw the food trucks in the front. You have to understand that the camps now, millions of people are coming to visit this place every year, and they're selling food by the entrance. And my mother couldn't take it. It really affected her really bad, because we were in the camp, she said, starving for a piece of bread. And here they're standing and selling sandwiches in front of the gate. This really upset her a lot. And for as far as me, you know, I was very emotional visiting the camps every step of the way there.
Thank you very much. When you arrived in Israel, do you know if your mother recognized you immediately?
Well, I was brought, I guess I was told that this is her son. She left me as a baby, so I don't know, but she recognized me. I assume she recognized me right away. She hugged me and kissed me all over. So I guess there was a mother-son connection.
Thank you very much. Well, that's just about all the questions we have time for. If Rita is in the background, if she would like to introduce her, no pressure, but I think I hear her over.
Michael wants to introduce yourself.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Rita. I'd like to introduce the audience to Rita. This is Jerry's wife, and as I mentioned earlier, she is also a docent at the museum, and we're very grateful for both of them for everything they do for our community.
Thank you. I want to say hello. I think a couple of friends are on. One friend from Northridge and friends from New Jersey. So if they're watching, hello. Thank you for coming. And we always, we think it's so important what you are doing. And we just love being with the students and giving the message, like we always say, don't be a bystander, speak up, do the right thing, right?
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for translating Jerry's mother's poems as well.
We still found, other than those, we found a couple in Yiddish that maybe we can sit together and work on those. And then there's a couple in Polish, so I need a Polish translator for that as well. And maybe then we can compile everything together. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you both so much again for everything you do for our community. And thank you, Jerry, for sharing your story with everyone this afternoon. Thank you to our audience.
Thank you.
For your questions. And again, as a reminder, the museum is currently closed, but we have regular programs virtually. So please follow our website and social media. We hope to welcome everyone back to the museum in person when it's safe to open. In the meantime, please follow all of our programs. Thank you so much again to both of you and to our audience. And we wish everybody a happy, healthy, and safe weekend coming up.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Michael.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody. Take care. Be safe.